In this workshop, we're going to talk a little bit about open pedagogy. And open pedagogy is an approach where rather than having students consume existing content, students become actively engaged in creating their own content. And they share that so that the audience of this is larger than is typically the case. Often students write papers and you're the only one who sees their papers or their assignments or exams. And as a result, they may not have as much incentive to do the best quality work as they might if they know it's going to be shared at least within the class or perhaps to a global audience. And when they do that, it becomes a bit more of an authentic learning process. And in any case, however you do this, students are actively engaged in the learning process rather than passively reading through books or listening to lectures or other things. And one of the things, the type of assignments that we often do where students do some work, they submit it into the LMS, and they lose access to that when the semester ends, has often been called a disposable assignment, where essentially students are doing this work and then it's lost, it's done. It reduces the value of the assignment. When students create an assignment that lasts beyond the class period and has an audience that extends beyond the class, it's something that they can potentially be proud of. That if they're going to have some work that's posted on the web, they're going to create a video that's out on YouTube, if they're going to create a podcast that people can listen to in the future, if they're going to write something which is shared in a blog that they can make reference to, they often value it much more because they know that other people may be seeing this. And my first experience with this was when I was teaching a class in the history of economic thought, and I had students create a Wikipedia page for different schools of economic thoughts, or in some cases for different economists who made large contributions to the discipline. And it was open to the public. And I told them that, you know, the economic historian or people who work in the area of the history of economic thought would be able to look at their work and leave comments behind. And I told them I'd be inviting a few people who do this work to look at the work and give them feedback. And they were kind of excited about that. Since then, I've had students create podcasts, I had students create videos, and some of them have noted that by doing this, they know that they have work that they can share with their family, that they can tell their parents, look what I learned while I've been in college here. Or they know they could put it on their LinkedIn profiles as an example of some of their work. And when they have this work that's publicly shared, they tend to take much more pride in it. And that tends to be reflected in the amount of effort and the quality of the work product they're producing in the class. It can also be used for service learning activities. For example, I know some people have used projects where they've done transcriptions of historical documents or letters that were collected or handwritten documents, and for the National Archives or for other services. An example of a Wikipedia project that I saw on a I forgot which one it was, but I think it was in a Teaching in Higher Ed podcast a few years ago, was a group of students in Texas who were taking a class in Portuguese, and they wrote basically a Wikipedia page for their city on a Portuguese Wikipedia site, which at that point had virtually no information on their city. So they were actually engaged in the process of translation, and they were doing it though by talking about something they knew and creating public information that served a useful purpose. I know a lot of instructors who've had their students create books. Jessica Kruger a few years ago wasn't happy with any of the textbooks that were available, or actually she was teaching a course in wellness or in public health. And what happened was there were 3 books she was considering, each one of which had a portion of what she wanted to discuss in the class. And each one of the textbooks were over $100 each. I think the total cost would have been $400 or $500. So she had her students create their own textbook as they went through the course. So they created their own readings, and they ended up having it bound and distributed at the end of the course as something that could be used by anyone in those courses. So when students are creating something that has value to other people, it's a form of service learning. It has some intrinsic value beyond just doing something for a grade in the course. There's a lot of examples. One thing you could do simply is have students annotate online content. You could use something like Hypothesis and have them go out and add annotations to it. So to provide online discussions of directly embedded within websites, for example. You could have students create blogs that are public facing. You could have them create Wikipedia where they're sharing some information with others. You could also have them create glossaries. We had a person in our theater department a few years ago who had students create a glossary of terms in the work of Shakespeare, because a lot of the terms students were not familiar with. So she said, well, let's create a glossary that we can use to help people understand this. And you could do that in practically any discipline and provide a learning resource for other students. And you could also have students create podcasts. I've had that done, I think 4 or 5 classes now. You could have students create videos that are shared publicly. There have been cases where college students have created explainer videos that are posted publicly to be used by high school chemistry students, for example. So by explaining these things, students tend to learn things much more deeply. And, as faculty members, many of us have noted that we really came to understand our discipline far more when we had to teach it than when we were students who just needed to know enough to be able to get through exams. And so having students go through that same process as students is a really good way of encouraging deeper learning. You could have students do research projects that are posted publicly. And I've seen examples of that in many disciplines. You could also have students do book creation projects, as was done by Jessica Kruger. And there's many other examples out there. So why might you use open pedagogy? I think we've already talked a little bit about some of those things, but one of the main purposes that people tend to adopt this for is because it can have some really substantial effects on student motivation. Students are often really excited to create this work that they're going to be able to share publicly and have access to long after the class ends. That non-disposable nature of those assignments. The public audience is a big part of that. And again, it's active learning, and what all the research shows, and there have been hundreds, maybe even thousands of studies, that when students are engaged in active learning, they tend to learn things more deeply and they tend to remember them longer. And they're also more likely to be able to transfer the concepts that they've learned to new applications. There's a lot of things you have to consider when doing an open pedagogy project. The first one is, does it really fit your course outcomes? That you shouldn't be doing an open pedagogy project just for the sake of doing it. It should be something that ties to the learning objectives for your class. So start with what the class is supposed to help your students achieve, and then think about ways in which open pedagogy projects can help do that. One concern that anyone beginning an open pedagogy project often thinks about, or a concern they have, is how students may feel about privacy. Some students do not want to share their work publicly. Some students are reluctant. They may have some situations where they might be undocumented, or in a family where there's some undocumented members and they don't want to leave a trail out there online. Some students may be may have had past abusive relationships, and they don't want to have material posted that would perhaps open them to some further abuse. Some students may just not be comfortable doing that for any number of reasons. So you have to think of some ways in which you can accommodate student privacy while still having the project that can work for everyone. A simple thing you can do is, if students are doing work publicly, you could have them create a pseudonym, or you could have some of the work published as an anonymous work. Or if students even then feel uncomfortable with it, you can always give them some option where they share it perhaps either within the class or with just you, if their concerns are really serious and need something further to address. So think about ways of addressing student privacy concerns. I've been doing this for a few years now, and I've not yet experienced this, but that's been due to chance. I know other people have experienced it. So be aware if you're doing this, or think about ways in which you can accommodate student requests. If students are going to be working in projects, it's generally beneficial for them to work in groups and come up with a plan for the collaboration. Come up with a plan in which you're able to ensure that students are able to, in which all students are fully engaged in the project. Because with group work, there's always a potential that some students may shirk a little bit on their tasks, and provide some way of maintaining accountability so that you can at least ensure that all students are doing their appropriate share of the work. And a simple way of doing that is having students at the beginning of a project talk about or come up with plans for engagement, describing how they're going to work together, how they're going to make sure that everyone contributes a share, and how they're going to make progress forward. And periodically giving the group some processing time during class, for example, where they can talk about what's working and what's not working so well, so they can resolve any conflicts. And conflicts are unavoidable in many cases, but by giving them some time to process it, to come up with an agreement within the group of what each person will do, and referring back to that, and then discussing things as it moves through, can help reduce those quite a bit. You know, there's often a student who just disappears, and then you may have to make some adjustments in the grading. You know, one option is to just simply remove that person from the group and give them some alternative assignment if they truly have disappeared, or at least work with the group so that there's some way in which they can make progress, perhaps on a scaled down version of their original plan. If they lose, let's say if you have a group of 3 and you lose one person, you may want to make adjustments in the work they're expected to do for the remaining students. And provides for some plan for feedback and revision. We've talked about the importance of feedback in a lot of workshops here. But one thing you can do is leverage peer feedback, that students learn a lot from each other. And the research on that is really overwhelming, that students can often benefit more from peer feedback than just from instructor feedback. And it's also a lot less work. When I've had students work in semester-long projects, before I give them feedback on a stage, I have them in groups give feedback to each other groups. In particular, I tend to do that within the course learning management system using Hypothesis, where the work, because this is primarily written work in this case, where they share a document, it's downloaded as a PDF, put into the learning management system, and then set up as a Hypothesis assignment where students can have a discussion on the work right within the work. And they can have little discussion threads going on that are embedded right within the assignment. And that works really, really well. And then that actually reduces the amount of work I have to do in giving feedback. You know, sometimes going through, I can just say, I agree with these comments, that this is an area that needs to be addressed, and providing other feedback that way. And make sure you do provide students so with lots of feedback along the way. One thing you do have to discuss with students in any public facing, well, in any work, but especially in work that may be public facing, is issues of copyright and intellectual integrity, that you have to remind students that they can't just copy and paste documents or images or other items. And students tend to have the most trouble, from what I've seen, in using images. And you have to work through that with them, because it is an adjustment, because they've often worked through a system where they could copy and paste an image or a graph or some other work, or even just grabbing a block of text and pasting it in without full citation. So make sure you work on that with students. It's going to be a little more interesting in a world where we have things like ChatGPT. But if you have a really carefully scaffolded assignment that they're working through, where they're getting feedback at each stages, it becomes less likely that they'll be able to just copy and paste things. And in terms of just copying other people's materials without attribution, that's actually often less severe in the case of open pedagogy assignments than it is with documents and work they submit only for your review, because you can remind them that the work that they're posting will be public. And if they're using someone else's work without attribution, then those people might very well find it and file a takedown notice and so forth. And that really wouldn't look particularly good for them. So students are much less, from my experience at least, I've seen far fewer cases of academic integrity violations when doing open pedagogy projects. And I have had cases of that, and it does occur. I haven't had it yet in any of the podcast assignments I've done, but I know Derek Ruff has talked about cases in Vanderbilt where a number of classes at least use podcast assignments, where students would essentially download the work of other people and just read it as part of a podcast. And again, that's something we have to remind them that can be pretty easily caught. And in general, that is not a good thing to do, that they want their work to actually be their work. And one thing you do want to do, though, is that if you are going to have students do work that's going to be posted publicly, you want to be able to find some sort of way of a mechanism for hosting that will be sustainable. Because if you just post it on some type of service that goes away in a year or two, that will not give them the same sort of benefit as if you post things in a way that's sustainable. For example, I had students create books for previous projects on Pressbooks. And at the time, Pressbooks was free, but with a small cost of between $35 to I think about $95, you could expand it so that watermarks were removed and so forth, and it provided long-term hosting capabilities. But now you can still, now you have to pay by the month to do it. So that option has gone away, and it's fairly expensive. It would cost me about $180, I think, a month just to host the existing books if they were not Creative Commons, because WordPress has grandfathered in any documents or any books that were posted earlier that were released with a Creative Commons license. And fortunately, in the case of these books, they were. So the books are available, but they can no longer edit those without me paying a fair amount. So you want to find a way of hosting it, preferably for free or at low cost, so that your institution or you can pick up the cost without much of a concern. Here at SUNY Oswego, we have the option of working through the SUNY Create process, which provides a reclaim hosting server that you can sponsor, or you could have students do it directly, where essentially, as long as SUNY maintains that service, and it's been active for about 4 or 5 years now, I think at least 4 years, you'll be able to post things for there at no cost. So that's, for people in SUNY, that's a good way of going about providing that sort of sustainability. And there is a Pressbooks instance on that now, which if we do a book project in my class this spring, is what I'm going to do with it again. And I say if, because I've given students the option. I describe what open pedagogy projects are, and I ask them if they'd rather go back to a traditional way where they all write their own research papers, their own sort of senior thesis type of thing, or if they wanted to do some type of group collaborative project that's posted publicly. And for the last 4 years now, they've chosen that option, and that's worked quite well. And they find it much more interesting and engaging. And honestly, I find it much more interesting than reading the sort of end of term papers that I generally get year after year. The topics would change a little bit, but the quality of the work tends to be much greater when it's done in this way.
I've done something, so I teach in health promotion and wellness. So I don't know if it's necessarily would be considered open pedagogy, but what in my program planning course, they actually throughout the entire semester scaffolding of assignments, and they're creating and planning a health promotion program that they then actually implement on campus. So it is something that I've noticed with, obviously in health, one-stop shop programs, we don't encourage those, right? But with it being a course, like sustainability wise, the students in their groups, they create it one time, they get to implement it. It is for the public, so they are creating materials throughout the semester, which the copyright and stuff, we've talked about that, and they have to create certain things and use research. But I don't know if it would necessarily be considered open pedagogy, but I'm trying to think of ways.
It would at least be considered authentic learning.
Yeah.
They're doing something that it's a service learning project. Yeah. They're doing something that has meaning and value. And that's actually, the same sort of motivation for
Then,
open
yeah.
pedagogy, that they're creating something that has for the public good,
Yeah,
that it goes beyond them doing something to get a grade in the
Right.
class that has no value after
right,
that, to something that may have an impact on people's lives.
right.
And that's a really powerful
Yeah.
motivator.
Yeah, I think what I've noticed by doing that, because also then in our implementation course, they actually do an implementation of interventions for the community setting. So some of our colleagues are at different areas in the community, older adult homes and things like that. And the student motivation, because they feel as though it's, they have ownership over what they've created. So there's high motivation to be successful and to also just have fun. There's a little bit of creativity that comes into it too. that I
Which
think
doesn't
they enjoy.
always show up in the same
Yeah.
way of students writing a 20-page
Paper
paper.
or, right, yeah,
So yeah, that intrinsic value is really important
Yeah.
with any of these type
yeah,
of projects. One issue, and this came up in a previous workshop, is how do we evaluate individual contributions? There's a lot of ways of doing it. For group work with papers, with writing projects, I've generally had students just write in each different colors in a Google Doc so you could see the individual contributions.
Mhm.
This was suggested by Jessica Kruger, who did that book project at Buffalo, in SUNY Buffalo. There's a lot of other ways. If you're doing things in Google Docs, you can actually look at the edits made by individual students. You could also have students evaluate each other with some type of a Google form or a survey form. Or you could just question each student on the work that they did, or have them write a weekly log, for example, describing their own contributions to the project, where they're reflecting on their learning each week, which again has some value just in terms of improving metacognition. So.
And sometimes I'll do like role delegations, but if you're wanting students to all collaborate on different or on everything, that could be something you may not want to use. But in this implementing the program, I do have them identify strengths in the group, then kind of role delegates, and they do kind of look at different areas that they're going to focus on, and they do come back together and kind of do feedback loops and things like that. So I've used that, which has been very successful. I haven't really had any group issues in the past couple of years. It's worked well for me. So, but again, I've also used the Google Docs too. So that's been a good.
And with podcast projects, it's pretty easy to see the contributions because the people are directly stating what they put together.
Yeah.
And often it involves reflections on how things they're learning connect to their own lives, which is a good thing anyway. So
and
there's
similarly,
a lot of ways of doing it.
I see them implement the program too. So
and
that's another way to be able to see where everybody was and how they've kind of implemented and worked together as a group.
So, but however you do it, you make sure that there's some way of evaluating individual contributions so that there's no incentive for students to shirk.
Yeah.
But again, if the project works well and it's something that students buy into, it's much less of an issue than it might be otherwise with group projects. And again, we do live in a world in which much content is digital. Make sure you provide students with some basic instruction on digital accessibility. If they're creating audio or video files, make sure they have transcripts. If they're creating documents, make sure they put in the appropriate tags and so forth and structure so that it can be read by screen readers and so on. So at least providing students with some of the basics of accessibility is useful. When I have them write a book, we actually spend a portion of a class period just deciding what the structure that each chapter of the book will be in terms of what level, what the level of subheaders we're going to do, whether we're doing just A heads or A and B heads, for example, or H1, H2 and H3 heads for, within the chapters, or whether we, or whether they want to go to lower levels of, or more granular breakdown of content within. Typically, we don't go beyond 2 levels of headings, but we also agree on a font. We agree on, the font colors and other things, while talking a little bit about, color contrast and other issues and readability issues. And making sure that all images are captioned with text that describes the images and so forth. And that's actually something that students struggle with a bit because, the first few submissions often don't fully meet those requirements. But yeah, but they pick up and they do learn from each other. And, if someone's struggling with it, they'll often ask other people who've been able to come up with better solutions. If you are going to release some work publicly, the most common way of doing it is using some type of Creative Commons license. The simplest is CC BY, which is just the attribution license, which means anyone who uses the work is free to use it however they want, but they have to provide attribution to the original developers. So other people can modify it. They could even sell work that's based on this. That hasn't been much of an issue for most student projects, because you generally don't see publishers going out and grabbing student work and publishing those and selling the work later. But if, oops, what happened there? Oh, I know what I did. I clicked on the, I clicked somewhere, apparently there was a link there and I don't see it, but it's there. Okay, so that's the most basic form, or the most open form, other than public domain, where you wouldn't even have to cite it, which is sometimes referred to as CC0. You could also put in a slightly more restrictive, and I go through this with students before they decide how they're going to release it. And so far, actually, all the student work that have been done in my class has been under a CC BY license. But if you want to make it just a little bit more restrictive, you could release it under a share alike option, which means that any derivative work that it uses some of the work that you've created must be shared under the same license. So if a commercial publisher wanted to use your work, for example, they would be able to, but they would have to make any derivative works based on it, any work that they used your work in, also available under a share alike agreement. So anyone would be free to copy and use it, subject to attribution. You could go a little bit, well, quite a bit further by putting in the ND restriction, which is no derivative work. When what that means basically is any work you create could be redistributed and used, but it has to be used in exactly the same format. This is most often used with creative work such as images and artwork or music, where people may, if they release them under a CC BY ND, no derivatives license, people are free to use the work, and as long as they cite it. They all have that BY restriction in it, that you have to provide attribution to the original creators, but you couldn't modify it. So you couldn't take an image and add additional layers to the image or distort it in some way or take a portion of it. And that's, again, most common with other forms of creative expression, artwork and music and so on. You could also put in a non-commercial restriction, which means people are free to use it as long as they provide attribution, but they can't use it in anything they sell. And I've always expected students to at least consider that, but generally they haven't expressed any concerns about commercial use. I think they'd be kind of happy if commercial use occurred with much of the work. You can also add, or you can combine these in various ways. So you could put in a CC BY with non-commercial distribution restrictions and a share alike requirement. So, and again, you could throw in an ND. Any combination of those attributes is possible. And so forth. And there's a link that apparently I clicked on somehow. I don't know how, because it wasn't visible at the time, but oh well. In any case, that gives you a description of each, and it will also give you a little embed code to embed an image that describes each of the licenses right on the work itself. And also, and this is available under a CC BY license, a faculty member who have had students do creative work that is shared publicly, it's a student release form. So you're welcome to use this as long as you provide attribution to the person who originally created it. And now, if we had a larger group here, we could talk about what types of assignments you use, but this is something you may want to think about. What are you doing now? And what types of projects might you be able to do in the future that would have this public aspect to it? And there's a resource that Judy Littlejohn and I put together a few years ago for a presentation related to this. It's called openobjectives.org. You can either aim your camera at that QR code, or if you download the slides, which I think we have a link to that. If not, just go to this website, and it has a lot of resources that have been put together on open pedagogy projects. Just go to the open pedagogy projects right here. We've added some other things since then, but there's, oh, wait. Something is missing from here. It looks like a page may have been hidden. Let's go right to open pedagogy resources, and they should all be there. Okay.
There we go.
This is where I wanted to go. I'll have to fix the links. Something got changed there. But in any case, these are some broad examples of open pedagogy resources. So if you, for example, go to blogs, you can click on this and get some example blogs that have been used in support of open pedagogy projects. Here are some particular from Vanderbilt University when they had a big project on this. You could also go back and close this and then look at some resources which gives some podcasts or some documents or other things describing how blogs could be used in learning, and often some research results are there. You could look at students who do collation of grouping materials together and sharing them, tagging them, organizing materials online for other uses. And there's some really nice examples out there. A really nice project is the fashion history timeline at the Fashion Institute of Technology. You can go there and students create examples of fashion in particular periods with images, with documentation, with descriptions, and other content. There's a Baltimore Uprising, the 2015 archive project, the Appalachian Oral History Project interviews between 1965 and 89 have many, many interviews with people in the Appalachians. Appalachian. Okay. Sorry about that. And oops, okay, and so, and there's a lot of other examples as we go through here. E-portfolios is another way of doing it. Often this is done by departments throughout a student or throughout an entire institution, where students collect the work as they do it and they post it on an e-portfolio so that they have samples of the work available to potential employers and so forth in the future. And sometimes these will last beyond their time in college. Other times they can take them and port them into their own website and so forth. And there's a lot of examples out here where students could do podcasts. They could remix and annotate online content, service learning projects, student created ancillaries such as study guides, videos, and so forth, student created books, student created videos, and student wiki projects. And here's some broad examples of open pedagogy projects. There was a SUNY task group that spent a couple years collecting resources on open pedagogy. They've shared this resource as well as a collection available in Twine. There's the Open Pedagogy Notebook that was created by Robin DeRosa and some other people that has a lot of resources on this. And Robin DeRosa has been a leader in the Open Pedagogy Project. She got me interested in doing this in my own classes a few years back. There's some examples from a number of sites. And here's some SUNY. Here's a link to SUNY Create, which I mentioned. Ed Beck has lots of links to open pedagogy project he's worked with. He's an instructional designer at SUNY Oneonta, and he's been heavily involved with this. And actually was one of the principal investigators on the grant that created SUNY Create, which has now moved to SUNY OER Services. And here's the OER community series, a series of workshops, I believe, in that. Oops. Well, apparently that is no longer there. It was an OER community class. My guess is it probably moved to another site. This was last updated about a year ago. So I'll have to check into that. But in any case, you do have the option here if you have some open, if you're aware of any other projects or have done some of your own, you're welcome to contribute to that and we'll add them to the website. So that's it. If you have any questions or if you have any suggestions, use that form at the end of this. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And I guess I didn't put in a link to the slides this time. But if you would like the slides, just send me an email and I'm happy to share them. And that's it. Let me stop the recording.